go to assembly language so I can write your C so you can write your other languages. Okay. All right. I don't remember your name, but you were saying you do web components. What was the framework you're using? Stencil. Okay. I have not actually played with Stencil, but I've gone through a lot of the other frameworks, and I find them all very heavy. But we'll get to that. Hopefully you guys can hear me without me being too loud. So Mike Collins, I started coding with the TRS-80 Model 1. Do any of you even know what the heck that is? Have you ever even seen a picture of it? Okay. Way back in the day, you had the Apple I and the TRS-80, and then he had a bunch of off things like the Sinclair's EX80 and anyway, a lot of the Commodore PET and stuff like that. The origin to the personal computer, right? And I started in junior high. My electronics teacher got in 3 of them, had no idea what to do with them. He handed me the manual. I brought it home, read the whole thing that night, and it's like, oh, that makes sense. I started coding the next day. It just did. It just made total sense to me. Now, back then it was basic. So I started coding professionally in '81. I was only 16 years old. And I've coded in 7 different assembly languages and over 20 or 10 high-level languages. And I still prefer JavaScript. I wrote the entire firmware for an undersea robotic welding system and a basic compiler for the same company called KEC, Kinetic Energy Corporation. That was a blast. I wrote my first HTML for Netscape Navigator and IE3, what came out for Windows early. I've worked for Software Toolworks, Broadband, Intel, Family Search, and about 7 different companies beyond that, plus 2 that I've tried myself. And I'm a coder, I'm not a biller, and I go broke real fast, but I get a lot done. And I've used just about every modern JavaScript framework, but I still prefer vanilla JS with a handful of libraries. And most of those I've written myself. And this is the most important. I believe that as a senior developer and an architect, my job is to make things easier, faster, and smaller for both the front end, or for both the developer and the end user. And I think a lot of frameworks get this wrong. They make things a lot easier for the developer by throwing a huge cost onto the end user. So web frameworks, right? Before jQuery, JavaScript was a pain in the butt. Right? The differences between IE and Netscape at the time were so incredibly different that your JavaScript, well, you'd have to write almost 2 apps to make it work. jQuery was the best godsend of them all. I've used MooTools, I've used all the rest of them, and jQuery by far kicked butt. And honestly, I don't know if a lot of you guys know this, but things like Query Selector All and so forth, those came about because of jQuery. It was basically the way jQuery did things, like, oh, we should throw that into the browsers and we should make it a standard. So there's a lot of things. Class name is another one that came about because of jQuery. Frameworks and libraries are designed to solve hard things, not only in web development and anything, but oftentimes at steep cost. Very complicated rules, most of them, non-standard terminology and technology. So you got to learn entirely new things to understand what you're going on there. And a lot of times you have to write code just because the framework needs it. Right? Frameworks end up a lot of times getting very verbose. Angular, my current client, I'm doing Angular. I would love to, anyway, I do not like Angular. Angular is probably the heaviest write it for the framework's sake. TypeScript, I know a lot of you guys say you like TypeScript. I hate TypeScript. But I do like JS docs types. And you get a lot of the same benefit without needing to recompile. And so I use JS doc types. A lot of times they're slow, the runtime engines suck up a ton of memory, and they're insanely hard to debug. Has anybody done Angular JS? Not Angular, but Angular JS. Okay, you get an error. Shows up on the bottom, you click on a link, it takes you to a page. That's not it. So you click on another link, it takes you another one, another one, another one, another one, another one. And finally, about 17 pages down, you finally get, oh, that's all it was. It was horrible. They're a little better now, but still, 99% of the time, the error happens in the framework and not in your code. You have no idea what really went wrong. So they're just so hard to debug. And then also they oftentimes go counter to the rule of least power. In general, the rule of least power says you want to do the most you can in the technology that is the least powerful. In web development, that would be 90% in HTML, 8% in CSS, and 2% in JavaScript. But most of these frameworks have completely flipped the script, and you're writing 100% in JavaScript, which is not the least powerful technology. And of course, the biggest cost, now I don't know how many of you have gone through this. When I was at Family Search, we wrote raw JavaScript, then we switched to jQuery, then we added our own class hierarchy, then we went ahead and moved on to AngularJS, and then we moved on to Polymer, and now they're finally React. Now it might stay for a while, right? I think we're finally getting past this terminal velocity of new frameworks, but I'm introducing one, so what the heck. But the cost was horrible, right? I mean, I taught people, I said, look, put as much code as you can in raw JavaScript services, if you will, right? Things that don't change. And then deal with the framework only when you need to. And the few teams that did that, when they every time they'd switch, it's like, that's fine. 80 to 90% of our code is reusable. And we only have to do this little bit for the framework to make the framework work. So that's a great way to do this. Web components. They're great, but they're so hard to create. Now, I don't know about Stencil. I'm thinking Stencil helps. Lit, which I'll talk about in a second, is probably one of the best ones out there just due to how complicated they are to work with it. And we'll talk about that. So 2011, they came out with the V0 spec. And then they came out very quickly with the V1 spec, which is what's current. As of 2019, all current browsers support it completely. Well, mostly completely. Safari is refusing to do a couple things, and Safari's actually been probably the biggest pain for web components there's been, but there are ways around that with polyfills. Web components, if you've ever seen one written manually, they are huge on boilerplate. And that's probably the #1 reason why most people don't like web components. You got to write a crap load of code just to be able to get hello world up on the screen. I'll show you a simple one, but they're still tough. It's hard to act like a native element because of all the boilerplate code you got put in there. They finally recently added the ability for a custom component to act like a form element. This is fairly recent. And it was like, finally. I used to do it to where I would have my component actually living in Shadow DOM, and then if I wanted to emulate being a form element, I would add a hidden form element next to me so that the form could actually get to it, and then I would just fill it with the data that I wanted. And that was my only way around it. Now that's been taken care of. No data binding, no event binding other than the standard JavaScript capabilities. And then CSS can be a problem, and I can guarantee if you've written web components and you try to write one outside of Shadow DOM, you either didn't know this problem existed or you've scratched your head for hours. And that is that if you create a non-Shadow DOM web component and that component gets stuck into somebody else's Shadow DOM to web component, you have to put your CSS in there. If you don't get your CSS. And if it's not inside of another Shadow DOM to web component, then you have to put it up at head or body. So it can get complicated. So 2 examples of a standard web component. And admittedly, these don't seem very big, but they don't do anything. So the top one is non-Shadow DOM. And basically when the connected callback happens, and this is when the component is actually inserted into the DOM, then it would go ahead and it would add some CSS saying, I want my H1 to be blue and I want an H1 in there that says hello. Then the last line there is you're defining the tag name of minimal component, and you're attaching it to that class. For Shadow DOM, it's similar, but you can actually do things in the constructor, and there's some rules about what you can and can't do in a constructor. You call super because you need HTML element to actually do its constructor code. You go ahead and you create your Shadow DOM, you insert your HTML into it, including the CSS. And then you define it. One of the things that I'm frustrated with, and you might get this, if anybody else has done this, I wish when they created web components that they had come up with a way to define the user agent styles at the definition point, right? So in this call, there should have been a way to say, oh, the styles for this component, I'm going to define them once. Here they are. But right now you have to insert the style into every copy of the component that you want. So that's another problem I'm working on trying to help get resolved. Stencil, one of them, right? Polymer was the first, probably biggest one originally. Their goal was to try and bridge the gap between the V0 spec, the V1 spec, and browsers without support. And it was supposed to eventually fade away. And what actually happened is it just died completely. It kind of got replaced with Lit. There's Lightning Web Components, Slim.js, Stencil, and Lit. Bay is the newest one I've seen. Bay is actually pretty dang cool. And it was the inspiration for Evo. Theirs is template-based, and they, go look up bayjs.com at some point if you're interested. It's pretty cool. All of them have their pros and cons, but they all perform all of their work in the browser at runtime. And just for reference here, I started writing Evo back in February. I was introduced to Bay probably like mid-January, and this just kept turning in the back of my head. It's like, man, I know I can do better than this. And so I did. Oops, wrong way. Okay, so Evo Web Components. You go back to my belief as a senior developer is to make things easier, faster, smaller for both you and the end user. Evo is actually planned to be a series of features, kind of like React has a bunch of different things. Although it's getting to the point to where you really have to kind of use them all the time. I want to have just a series of things that you can use to make things better, but use what you need and only what you need. So easy for developers. I want you only to write what you have to write. I don't want you to have to write extra crap just because the framework requires it. I want it to be standards-based everywhere possible. And so far it has been. I want to get rid of as much boilerplate as possible. I want built-in data and event binding and conditional directives. And I have that. Fast and small runtime. I think I've got about a 2.5, 3K base class file. That's all that it takes. Minimal memory, CPU, and battery usage, right? I don't want this thing to die after spending 10 minutes on some website because it's sitting there doing a bunch of crap in the background when I'm not interacting with it. And I want to move as much work as possible to the compile time, not at runtime. So minimal Evo. So what we've got here, it's basically an HTML file. And I use HTML files simply because VS Code handles it the best. Right, it gives me all this stuff. I'm actually working on a VS Code plugin that will handle these even better, but right now it's not bad. It actually works pretty well. So you define a component, tell it what you want the tag to be. This is what that define element call uses. You produce a template, which is your HTML. If you want to, you can include styles, you can include JavaScript. Web components are class-based. And so in the style tag, and I'll show you this in a little bit, all of the code inside of the script field are actually members inside of the class. And so that's why I say the editors handle it well, but they throw a little error on there saying, well, this isn't really how you define this outside of a class, but I don't want you to have to write the class. So I'll improve that when I can. Oops. Okay, so this up here is the component, right? Here's the component file, and here's what it compiled into. It is a few more lines than it would be if you had to write it yourself, but that's because I'm trying to be a framework or at least a library. The idea is I take whatever's in the template and I toss it in here. I take whatever your styles are here. I use the base class. I create the DOM, And this is extra, right? I always include the build date and the build version inside the components so that if you ever want to, you can check and see what's in there. I do plan on, right now I've got this, this base class file. I do plan on having these automatically versioned as well by name. And so when you build it, it will actually import the appropriate one, which will then allow you to have 5 different versions if you want to, and it won't matter, right? Because you'll always load the right one. So just in case you want to use it, this will be out public by the end of the month. I wanted to have it done before this meeting, and I'm just not quite there yet. I've got about 17 more bugs I've got to get fixed before I can really call it good. Once it is, you'll just install it from NPM. Initially, and honestly, I could use somebody's help with this because I'm not sure how to automate this. You just have to copy the base class file, and if you want it, the router file into your JS folder, or, you know, whatever you're going to be distributing. Create a template folder, start writing your template files, add this one entry to actually build the Evo components, import them, the finished ones, import them into your HTML and use it. And I am looking for beta testers. I'm looking for people that want to be able to start using this. And as you go through it, you can decide if you want to do that. Hold on. Oh. I never said I was an entertainer. Sorry. Okay, this here is my entire set, and I don't remember how many I've got. I've got, you know, a handful of components right here. This is the compile time. 110 milliseconds for all those components that I've got. Now, none of them are huge, except like my login dialog and so forth, but it's fast. Okay, so again, in the component from that previous example, there's the template, the style, the script, and then what I'm calling script root. And the reason I have to have a different script tag is because what's inside a script are member variables and member functions that go inside the class. And I needed you to be able to have stuff that you could put at the top of the file. So if you want to import, if you want to define things outside of the class, export, whatever you want, you can do that by putting it in the script root section. And then, like I said, I use the HTML because editors support it fairly well. So CPAs, and you know, I know earlier on I said, you know, non-common, God, that's not good. Non-common terminology, and here I am throwing in new term. It's hard to come up with the name. We all know that, we're developers. Component property attributes. What these are is these are attributes on the component tag. So this case right here, that define a property of your component. And so they start with a colon. You tell us what it is. You have an optional way of telling it what the style, what the type is, and I'll show those in a minute. And then also its default value. In your template, you use them, and I'll get into that in more detail. But in this particular case, I'm saying I want the text content to be whatever is in this message variable at runtime. And we'll get into that a lot more as we go on. The CPAs are transpiled into getter and setter properties in the actual component. And so here's the same component, right? MyL is being put in here 3 different times, and I pass in an attribute. And if you go back to what this is doing, we're just saying this is message. Now, not only does it become a property, but if it is a public CPA, it also watches that attribute. So as you change the attribute, it will also then change the property internally. Now, similar to how value works on an input tag, where value, if you change the element dot value, it does not change the attribute, but it does change the value. And the reason for that is they leave that value there. So if you call reset on the form, it pulls it back out of the value attribute and sticks it back into the value. So similar types of things here. Okay, so all right, so this particular element right here, you'll see it has this value here, and I can change this to whatever I want, and you'll see it changes there. Now on this as well, I can do and you'll notice it changed in here, but it did not change here. And I actually have a way to do that if you want it that I'll explain in just a minute. So CPAs, you define them in kebab case in the component tag. The built-in data types that I support are string or stir, Boolean, number, integer, big int, date, array, and object. I'm not going to try to support all of the funky array types. That won't, it's an array. I don't care what kind of array it is. It's just an array. Stir is the default. So if you define a CPA and you don't actually give it equals quote something, it just becomes a string with an empty value as default. Int, big int, and num can have optional min and max limits applied to it when you define them. So it'll guarantee that it keeps the value within that range. Arrays and objects can use the JS docs types so that you can define it. And I'll show that in a future slide. And then you define those inside the script root block. So you can go ahead and create your own comments up the top for all your JS docs type stuff, and then use that inside so that you have an idea of what you're doing. Start with a colon to define the CPA, right? So this is just an example here, a public name. Now you can create, if you want to have it affect the component's attribute, right? In that example I gave you, it didn't affect the attribute. If you simply put a plus in the beginning of it, you're saying, oh, I want you to also affect the attribute. So when the property changes, it will change it in the attribute. This is really important for CSS rules, right? Because CSS can't look at a property on a custom element. You need, although they're looking at that, but for now you can have it to where it'll actually affect the attribute on the component. If you put colon pound, then that's a private CPA. And I'm using this off of the concept of built-in JavaScript private member variables, right? A private member variable like down here, you just have pound in front of it, and it's private. Now, JavaScript natively does not support protected, so you have limitations that if you make a subclass, you can't use the private variable, and it's just the way they make it work. But so you either just do colon, colon plus, or colon pound. Private CPAs will never change a component's attribute because they're private. They're meant to be used internally. So again, CPAs are compiled into property getter and setters. They convert the data to the data type you define where possible. So if you pass in quote 3 and it's an int, it's going to convert it to a numeric 3. Actually, it'll do a parse int on it and give you a 3. If you make it a number, it'll do a number with the value in it, so it comes back as whatever you pass in, so you can get like 3.5. Public CPAs, as I did in the example, can also be set through the component's attributes. So when you change the attribute, it actually changes the CPA internally. And because the CPA changes, then it handles its binding automatically. And that's the last thing, right? Everything can be data bound. So in this case, message starts off with Evo or hello Evo, and then you got a title. So in this particular case, this title is this CPA, and this message is this CPA. And I'm telling it to set the title property to whatever that value is, and I'm telling it to change the text, or set the text context to whatever is in the other one. Unlike a lot of your other frameworks, you can only put a CPA inside of your data binding. So you can't do like image plus, right? If this was your CPA, I'm not going to allow this, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I'll get into it in a minute. I might be able to do something, but not in the, definitely not in the first release. So Instead, what you do is you calculate your values and you place them into a different, probably private CPA, or you can use pipes. And so in this particular case, this would take the image CPA, pass it through the add ending pipe, which would then just append the .jpeg onto it and then return that value. So here is another component. This is the code for the component, and I don't know how well you can see that, but basically we start off with this Audi Evo and an integer with a value of 7. And so as I change, these two are not in the component, this is the component itself. And that's it, that's the whole component, right? The only thing I had to do was this to show you the example of I'm taking this age CPA and I'm converting it into this string. And so that's what happens right here is I'm saying, oh, when something updates, just go ahead and create that string. So as I flip this around, of course that works, and whatever I type in here shows up there. I didn't have to write any JavaScript except for generating that string. And had I done it through a pipe and I had an externally available pipe, I wouldn't have even had to write code then at all. Your data binding options. So CPAs are created using kebab case up inside the component tag, but they are used in the template and in your JavaScript in camel case. Now this is identical to the way CSS works, right? When you put CSS, you get like, background dash whatever, right? Or margin dash top. But when you deal with them through code, it's margin capital T for top, right? So I follow those same rules. Again, I'm trying to stick with the basic standards that exist. Normally data binding is done through properties, but things that exist prior to Evo may not support attributes. There are a couple things where you have a property, you don't have an attribute, or you have an attribute and you don't have a property. HTML is kind of weird. So you can say, all right, I want to bind to an attribute. You just do attr dot, and this will then bind to the showing attribute. If this CPA happens to be null, then it will remove the attribute. And so you have a way to be able to add and remove your attributes. You can also do ARIA stuff. And anybody who's familiar with the data set, you can set things on the data set. Now, if you don't need to use a CPA in here, if this is just going to be a hard-coded value, then you don't need this, right? Don't make this into a binding thing. You just do data dash thing or ARIA dash label. I specifically chose to do dots, but I'm not opposed to changing it to dashes. I did it because I wanted to make sure people had a clear vision of, oh, okay, this is using CPAs, this is not. And then the two oddballs are text really changes text content and inner HTML is HTML. I thought about putting text content, but again, one of my goals is to reduce what you guys have to write. So it's automatic, right? React is really good at doing what it does, and it does it by creating this virtual DOM. Lit does the same thing. Anybody who's done lit HTML uses the template literal function to be able to do this. React uses their virtual DOM. And so you basically with React, you regenerate the entire virtual DOM, or with lit, you regenerate the entire thing. And then it does the comparison through, checking, oh, okay, what's different here? And then it changes what needs to be changed. I don't do that. Mainly because I don't have to, right? I know what's in the DOM. I know everything about it because we compiled it. And so in this particular case, I've got this CPA called message, and I'm using it here for the text content. And so in the setter for message, I do my type conversion. I make sure it's changed. If it has, I save it for the next comparison. And then I just set the text content to whatever that value is. And so I'm not rebuilding the DOM. I'm not creating a virtual DOM. I'm not doing any of that. I'm just saying, oh, I know this belongs there, and I put it there. And that's because I can do that through compilation. Two-way binding. And I think I've got another hole. I think I ran into a hole the other day that I haven't solved yet. If you want to do two-way binding, you just set $value on your input field and have it equal a CPA, and it will auto two-way bind for you. It just does it. I realized quickly that checkboxes and radio buttons are going to need to have colon check to work as well. So that'll end up going in there and so forth. But basically, adding colon value will set the elements dot value every time the CPA changes. And then it also adds a built-in input handler so that anytime you type something, it automatically takes that value back out and puts it back in the CPA. You can still add your own input handler event if you want, and I'll automatically handle that as well. It does the data grabbing first, and then it calls off into your thing. And I'm going to provide a way eventually for you to do your function first before it does the conversion. Checked will do the same thing, but it's not done yet. And the nice thing is that you can actually provide your component to be two-way bindable by just supporting the value property and dispatching an input event. As long as you do that, you can make your component completely two-way bindable. So here's the code. Again, I've got two different input fields. They're both bound to the same value, right? They're both bound to the CPA. And basically what's happening in the setter is that it says, oh, I'm going to go to element 1, which is this guy, and I'm going to go to element 3, which is this guy, and I'm going to go ahead and just set their values. And so what happens is that I type in one, it shows up in the other automatically. And that's the extent of the code, other than, you know, one line of code necessary to be inside of the input event handler. Wrong way. So pipes, data transformation. This is more similar to the Angular way of doing it, I think, than React kind of does. There are no pipes in React, right? You just manipulate the data how you want and pass it through. So I was really hesitant to even add these because my belief is change your data, tie the CPA to the right thing and manage it. But then it's like, you know what? No, things like monetary formatting or uppercasing, lowercase, whatever, right? You might want to be able to do that and not have to write code to do that. So it's like, fine, we can do that. There are a couple pipes that I include. And so that's one more file that if you want to, you can just drop it in your folder and import it and you can use them. But basically the pipe is defined like this, right? So it's a pipe, and for anybody who's ever used any command line tool, right, you're saying pass this through this. And in this particular case, this hat here means it's an imported pipe. Without it, so in this particular case, it's a private function called sanitize. And in this case, it's first going through the public function sanitize and then the imported function to upper. And so you can chain them as far as you want. It doesn't matter. I mean, it gets a little ridiculous. But if you're finding you're using the same pipe over and over again, don't do it. Calculate it once, put it in a different CPA, and then use that CPA everywhere. It's going to be a lot faster. So here is, again, this is the entire component. These are the three different pipes. Very simple functions. All I do is I take the value that's passed in, I lowercase it, and I return it. Uppercase it, return it. Reverse it, and return it. And so whether, doesn't matter what I'm typing, it just automatically handles them. Event binding. Originally, I thought about using colon on these as well, and I thought, no, there's a possibility you might want to have a property with a somewhat similar name, so no, I'm not going to mess with that. Instead, you start it with a dot. And the click handler is a member function for the class that you're in. So in this particular case, I'm saying when you click on this button, call the private function onClick, which is this function. You get the event and you get the data, and I'll tell you what the data is in just a minute. And here's the nice thing is, all I'm doing is I'm incrementing the count, which automatically affects this guy, right? And it's because of the value of the getters and setters. That setter is what does all the magic. So if you're familiar with data set, right, in this particular case, I've got data-locale. This is something they added quite a while ago that allows you to be able to add data that's kind of unrestricted on the JavaScript or on the DOM element so that you don't run into risks of using a name that might in the future end up getting used by that DOM element, right? So if you do data dash something, there's on the element, there's a data set property, and inside of that, then you get at it. And so in this particular case, you would do element.dataset.locale, and that'll give you this value. And so again, trying to stick with standards, it's like data sets of standards, I'm going to use that. And so what I do is in the event handlers is I automatically grab the entire data set from that object and I pass it through. Yes, you could get it from event.target.dataset, but it's like, again, I can write it once and you guys never have to. And again, if you want to just use a hard code value, you don't need to use the binding version of this. If you want it to be bound to a CPA, then you got to do :data dot. Okay, unfortunately, it's a little small, but this is the entire component that represents this guy over here. And really, the only real big difference here is that on each of these buttons, they all call the same function, but they have their data locales all set different: English, French, Russian, and Japanese. This is a little bit of code. That's because I wanted to use the international functionality of JavaScript. And so I go ahead and I do some formatting and I set this particular CPA, just defined up here somewhere, right here. I use this CPA, which then ends up populating back into this text area right here. And so as I click on these, you'll see up at the top that that is switching. And that's it. This is all I had to write to get that thing to work. Conditionals, if and switch. Don't like the way switch is working yet. It works, but I don't like the way it works yet. So I'm looking at probably trying to change that. If works really well. But because I wanted to separate view from controller, right now, if only works off of Boolean values. It's your job to calculate out the Boolean, and then and it has to go into a CPA, and then the CPA is used to automatically hide and show these things. Now, in the compiled code, literally what it's doing is it's saying, put this one in the DOM, take that one out. And it just holds on to it. Oh, you changed the state, put this one back, take that one back out. It is very, very fast. So in this particular example here, again, here's the code for it, and it's just changing. Now on this, let me show you one of the tricks that I do. You'll see these two comments in here. There's EL3 and EL4. You'll notice that this div is called EL4. If I change back, this one's EL3. So it is literally just taking it out and putting it into the DOM. And it knows where to put it because of that comment. Yes, you can screw this up. If you delete that comment, it's not going to know where to put it and it'll screw up. Come on. Looping. I might change the format of this right now, but you know, React, you got to have keys, right? Everybody knows what happens if you don't have keys. The world ends, dogs and cats start living together. Right now, what it is you tell it what the CPA variable is. You're going to call it item inside, and this is the name of the key. And here I did it different, right? I did UID because UID is actually a unique ID that we want to use as the key. And so that inside the code, I can do item.whatever. It enumerates through these items. I can do this as well. This is what I was telling you about with arrays and objects, is you can go ahead and use this definition based upon this. And so this is more for you than it is for anybody else. It's so that you know what's going on in your code, but so is TypeScript really. TypeScript doesn't do anything at runtime. It's just for you and for the editor to be able to help you. So in this case, I put item count and item name. Now, just for a little clarification here, in React or in Angular, you've got the double curly braces. And basically I could put the span and I could put the double curly braces right here, and then I would put item.name inside of that. This is a little bit different, right? Because with that in Angular, you could put, you know, my name is and then the double curly braces and item.name. And it's like, not sure I want to go there yet. I can. And if I get enough demand for it, I will. But basically you just put a span. Spans are like, total inline things. They don't change the font size or anything. And then you just tell it, I want the text of this span to be whatever that value is. Okay, so this is looping. I've done some comparisons and I'm having a hard time getting absolute numbers. I rewrote this component in React and Angular, and I want to rewrite it in Vue, and I'm not big on either React or Angular. So I don't think I did the best job, right? I'd love to get somebody who can actually do a better job than I did in these components. But the idea is I have this array of data and I want it to be rendered. And in this particular case, it just renders both the text field, the button, the number, and then the input field. Now, the nice thing is that I can automatically handle changes on an element inside of the array, which is very nice. At first, I was re-updating the entire array, and that really screwed things up. I can, of course, add to the array and sort. Now, this short of an array, yeah, any framework can go this fast. I had an array of 20,000 items, and I was still going this fast. I mean, a little bit slower, right? You're talking about milliseconds, but I couldn't get these speeds out of either Angular or React. And it's similar to what I do with the if, right? I've got the placeholders and I just put things in the DOM and so forth. I do DOM diffing in the sense that I use the key to determine where the element currently is, so that if it, like with the reverse, if you're just switching things, I'm not going to re-render the elements, I'm going to just move them. If you just change one value, then I'm only going to change that one value inside of that set of the DOM. Again, I'm trying to be as fast as possible. And that's all based upon the keys. And that's why you have to have unique keys. If you have, I don't currently have anything to validate that you don't have duplicate keys. I probably should, but that's not in there at this point. Lifecycle methods. Init, this happens after the constructor is finished. There again are a set of rules, and in the documentation I've got a link to those rules of what you can and cannot do in a constructor for a web component. The update function, basically right now, anytime any property is updated, this gets called with the old value and the new value. So inside of there, if you wanted to, the member is going to be whatever it is. So like in a lot of those, I had message or I had age or whatever, right? That'll be what the string that comes in here. And it will be the camel cased version of the name. This is the thing on the bottom. I am thinking of adding an on update ability to where instead of just having one update handler, you can register update handlers. You can say, oh, when that property changes, call me. I'm also thinking about allowing you to add, pass that in as an array. So you can say anytime any of these values change, call that handler. And again, that hopefully will help alleviate some of the, I could imagine the update function on complicated components getting really ugly, and I don't want that. For anybody who's used web components, you know about the connected callback, disconnected, adopted, maybe, and the attribute change callback. And I've got purposely renamed versions of these because I don't want you to do something. I don't want you to accidentally break something that you don't have to break. Referencing elements. So React, you've got useRef. Angular is what view child. I don't remember what it's called in Angular. I use it, but I just copy paste because I can't remember what it's called. There's a way that you can get a reference to the actual element so that you can manipulate it. As you've seen in some of these other examples, what Evo does is it automatically adds this EL equals to each of the elements that it's going to be doing something to. If it doesn't do anything to it, it doesn't actually assign it a value. There is no EL in that. And then what we do, and I don't have it on here, I'll get it in the next slide. You can just provide your own EL in the template and it will use this one instead of this one. Now you have a reference to it. And well, no, I do have it. So what happens is in the classes, I have this private member called ELs. And all of the elements are accessible by their EL name right off of that object. So you just do this.else.whatever, and you're talking to that element. You don't have to go look for it, it's just there. And so even if nothing else is happening to it, and so by default, Evo doesn't give it an EL, if you give it one, you still have access to it. Don't repeat the same, similar to the ID tag, right? You don't want to have the same names. Now, these are independent per component, and so it doesn't matter. Now, I've entered an issue in my GitHub because there might be a problem if you do non-shadow DOM. I got to figure that out. Dealing with these can be difficult in loops, and if you want to know more information, talk to me afterwards because it goes in pretty deep. Different types of binding. So first one, I'm using the public CPA val going into the title, and it basically just does this, right? The second one, I'm using a private CPA, which again is this. In the data dot, I just use the data set dot. Setting the attributes, I will set the attribute to the value, but if the value is null, then I remove it. That gives you a little flexibility. ARIA just does set attribute on the ARIA. ARIA is bizarre. Okay, most of your rules are you use intracaps or a camel case, and every time you've got a capital letter, when it converts it to kebab case, it puts the dash in front of that and puts lowercase. Not with ARIA. ARIA is really weird because you've got certain things. When you've got multiple words here, this is all lowercase, and yet they don't have dashes in between them. And yet it does convert it to intermixed caps. And it's like, you guys screwed things up. So this works without a problem. Again, HTML text, class. I couldn't believe it when React says, oh no, you have to use class name. Really? You couldn't fix that? And then style, basically I go ahead and I actually set the attribute to style because trying to deal with styles otherwise with the intermix between kebab case and camel case is a pain in the butt. HTML spec is huge. I don't think I've got everything, right? So as you're playing with this, please enter an issue and let me know when you've got a problem. I'll get them fixed as quick as possible. I want to follow as many native standards as possible. I want to simplify your job. I don't want to hurt the user. I want to reduce code size, memory size, improve speed. Part of this, I want to try and teach better practices. Who here has written a React class component? Didn't they tell you to do all of your functions as arrow functions? That breaks the standard. You're not allowed to use arrow functions for class members. You don't need to either, but they want you to. And the reason is because when they compile it, they take all of your functions and they stick them up in your constructor. And so you lose the benefit of class inheritance in JavaScript. Drove me nuts. I saw that, I thought, who thought that one up? I'm continuing to improve it and add other features. I have a Next.js kind of backend that I'm working on as well. I've got other things that I plan on making. I'm trying to build up a huge community for this. I really think this is going to simplify what a lot of people do. And here's the coolest part about this. Once you write an Evo component, you can throw away the original source if you want to. I wouldn't. This will work for everything moving forward, or at least it should, because it's based upon the existing standards of the web browser. And so I've used it in Angular, I've used it in React, I've used it in Vue. I haven't touched Svelte yet, so I can't tell you about that one, but it works everywhere. I plan on at some point creating my own version of kind of like NPM. But what'll happen is when you use this to download your components, one of the configuration settings you can put in your equivalent to a package JSON, maybe it'll actually be your package JSON, will tell it where to put the compiled components automatically. So even when you automatically download it, will automatically copy them into the right location. So if you've got a source static folder, it'll put them where you tell it to do it. But the biggest reason is I want developers to be able to share their components, right? I want this to be huge. I want people to say, wow, why haven't we been using web components before? One of my goals is to provide the Evo transpiler in JavaScript, C#, PHP, Python, Rust, and Java, so that no matter what framework your backend is for you .NET guys, you'll still be able to generate these without having to download Node. I don't want you to have to download Node. Why should you? You're in a .NET environment. Questions? No. I want to have my own repo system like NPM that's dedicated to nothing but web components. There are a couple attempts that have been made to do that, and they all suck, and most of the web components are, anyway, it exists. But it'll be similar to that in the sense that anybody who wants to put public up there can, and then anybody can download and use those components. Good question. Yes, this will be open source. Originally, I wasn't sure because I'm sitting here going, how on earth am I going to make any money for all my effort on this? I think I've got that solved. I want people to be able to use this. I want everybody to be able to use this. I want people to not have to rewrite things. I mean, sure, the UI team's going to come by and say, we don't like the way these things looks anymore. You got to change the way they look. I can't prevent that, but I can prevent you from having to rewrite a new component simply because you went from React to Pumbaa when it comes out. Companies love to make us change frameworks. Good question. I love the loosely typedness of JavaScript, which is why I'm not a big fan of TypeScript. I don't mind helping other people understand what I'm doing, but I don't like writing the extra code just to pretend to be type safe when you're really not at runtime. What I like about JavaScript is that I have the ability to do things in oftentimes many fewer lines of code than I could in a lot of other things. It's almost as fast as most of the other things nowadays too, right? I mean, once you start using the JIT compiler for Chrome, stuff runs insanely fast. Yes, there are things that are better, but that's where if you really want the speed, you move on to WebAssemblies. No, I don't plan on converting this to a WebAssembly. I like JavaScript. It's so easy to work in. Again, my mind can grab hold of this stuff and go, oh, I get exactly what's going on here. I've had sites that have been 700-800 files, and I know exactly what's going on in all of them. But I like how easy it is for me to make a quick change if I need to, without having to modify 5 or 6 files. I don't know if any of you have ever written a, God, what are they even called? ActiveX control under Windows. So early days of C, you had a C file and an H file. I had to have 2 files to maintain everything about it. Then they went to their, whatever the next step was, I don't know what it was. You had now had a 3rd file you had to manipulate. And then they went to ActiveX controls, which gave you a 4th file. Then they came out with C#, 1 file, right? Java, same thing, right? 1 file. It's like, oh my gosh, this is so much better. I like the simplicity. I hate writing code I don't have to write. And that's one of the reasons why I have a really hard time with Angular, because I have to write a crap load of code and it just drives me nuts. TypeScript, the same thing. It's like, man, I got to write this interface and I got to write this and I got to write this. Now I can finally write the code I wanted to write. I don't like that. I like being able to just sit down and get my code out. Now I'm okay with standards, right? The JS docs is great for me because it helps everybody else understand what I'm trying to do. Oh, thing on that. In the script tag, technically you can write TypeScript if you want to. What I'm going to add in here is the ability for it to generate a .ts file instead of a .js file. And then you would just include that as part of your TypeScript compilation. So your code can be TypeScript inside of it. It's not going to hurt anything. And TypeScript plus JS docs types work really well together. So I'm not going to prevent that, right? Because I know a lot of people love TypeScript. And so I want to make sure that I'm still helping you guys out without hindering you at all. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. And I'm not there yet, right? I do plan on having an ability to similar to how React and Angular both, when you save a change, it will automatically update the browser. Personally, I hate that because it's like, no, I don't want you to update your browser right now, but it'll be an option, right? And that's the thing, you'll be able to turn it on or off at your whim. It won't force you into it. I will have that eventually. Again, this is the command line, right? In this particular case, I'm just saying run build, and it compiled them all, right? Oh, so let me, so some interesting stuff. So this is a component. Yes, this is actually, I was gonna mention this. Yes, this entire presentation is written in Evo. I originally had this in Apple Keynote. Keynote sucks. Keynote is horrible. It forced me to jump through apps. I couldn't have demonstrations without going back and forth and everything else. And so basically I threw together, I think, 3 components. One of them is the one that just renders this stuff. Transferred all my data, added some examples, right? That's how I managed to embed the examples in here because it's in the browser. And there it was done. And this presentation will actually be included in the Evo repo so that you have an idea. All of the components I'm creating will be there. And then King Voon, I actually paid for a business license, so I'm not including it. But you can get it for free if you want to, or you can pay for it and get the business license if you want to. One of the things I am hoping to do with this is I started off going through, there's a React component. I don't know which group I got. I'm trying to replicate all those components. I'm also going to material design the React version of it because I think it's the most recent. And I'm trying to replicate probably about 70% of those. They'll just be built in. So when you pull down Evo, you'll immediately have access to all of those components. And because you'll have the template files, the XML template files, you can change them to do what you want with them, right? You can either use the compiled JS file right off the bat, or you can use the source file. So let me. So that's actually a really good question. I don't know how many of you understand how the difference is between Shadow DOM and non-Shadow DOM. Shadow DOM is a shell, a CSS shell around everything inside of it. People originally thought that Shadow DOM was equivalent to iframe, and it is not. Any JavaScript you put into, not in the class, but if you threw a script tag into your Shadow DOM, it's still accessible to everybody. Right? There is no separation of JavaScript at that point. They do their separation by putting everything into a class, and so you're safe at that point. The CSS, on the other hand, is much easier to write because you're only writing the CSS for that single component, not worried about leaking from the outside in or you leaking out. And so your CSS suddenly becomes insanely simpler to write because you're only writing for this. Now, I don't know how many of you guys know this yet. Let's see, I don't know if I have it on this one. What was this one? Recently they added, and I don't have the example here. They've recently added, what's it called? It's kind of like SAS, but built in now. It is a little different, so you can't follow the same rules. And, in SAS, the ampersand is the literal string of the thing above it. In the built-in one, and I don't know what they call it, it's actually the upper element, not the text. And so there are some things that you can't do with it. But, this CSS, you notice I'm doing H1, 2, 3, 4. It's like, because I don't care. I know nothing outside of this is ever going to see this CSS. And so there's a lot of value in being able to use Shadow DOM because you write a whole lot less stuff. Did that answer, hopefully? Oh, okay. So this is where CSS variables come into play. In this particular case, yeah, this guy got greatly simplified. Here's one I think has it. Okay, so here I've got these three variables defined, and I've got them with default values, right? And then in here, I just go ahead and use those variables. So technically, at any point, anybody above me can set these three variables, and it will change this guy. Now, my personal rule for this is I use my component name as part of the variable name. And that way I've got name segregation, right? I'm not going to worry about my variables running into somebody else's variables. That's the easiest way to do it. Now, there is another way, which is, I think it's this one. Yeah. The other thing you can do right here, you see this part? So what that allows you to do is inside the A tag, I have this part defined. And so what that CSS is doing is it's reaching in to the Shadow DOM and affecting that part with this value. So that was a more recent addition to Shadow DOM, is the ability to have parts. So there's two ways you can do it. One is on your element, you go ahead and you expose parts that you want people to be able to touch, and then they can do anything they want to it. The other way is using the variables, where you say, yeah, I don't want you messing with anything, but I will allow these things. We'll go ahead and set up the variables. Now, if you're talking about theming, a lot of times the best thing in the world you can do for theming is just create a buttload of variables which define all of your stuff, and then you just use them everywhere. And then if you go from dark mode to light mode, you just swap out what those variables are, and then everything automatically changes. Anything else? Okay, let me get a vote here. Who can see this as being useful in their immediate or near immediate future? And who thinks this is a load of crock? Okay. Web components do have a few idiosyncrasies, but what doesn't, right? React does, Angular does, Vue does, they all do. But I choose to use the idiosyncrasies that are built into the browser as opposed to adding new ones through another language, at least again, as much as possible. The cool thing here, let me go to one other. It's way too many. So a couple other things. These are a bunch of the different components, right? You've seen this guy before. I don't know what I was saying. Oh, actually, let me talk about routing, right? I had a friend who, as I was doing this, he's like, well, you got to have routing, right? And it's like, fine. So I created a router. And it uses push state like it's supposed to, so it doesn't actually go back and hit the browser or the server. And my entire lines of code for my router between two files is 120 lines of code. That's all it took. Now I'm doubting it's perfect, right? But it does handle So in the router, you can do things like this, which a lot of routers consider that to be the catch-all, right? If you know regex dot star basically means anything. In this particular case, I'm going explicit with these, but I can also, as I'm doing here in the slideshow, I've got a catch-all kind of for slideshow where I'm using colon page. One of the things that I plan on doing when the component becomes active is calling a specialized function where I can pass in basically any of the parameters off the URL. I didn't get that done, and so instead, right now, what you've got, let's see right here, what I do is I pull in the path name, the current path name. I run this regex on it, which goes ahead and figures out what page I'm on. Again, I can write this once in my compiler and in my runtime to where you guys never have to do it. And so I intend on doing that. But I support all of the standard routing capabilities that you would see in Express. So anybody who's written Node and is familiar with Express, I support that set. And it still came out to about 120 lines. Actually, there's a third file. It's another 30 lines. But it's not a lot. I was shocked. It's like, that's it. And the router is included, right? So if you want to use it, you can. And to use it, I have a WCA instead of an A tag. That was another one that it's kind of like, I understand why React did it. They've got their link to, I get that, but it's like, let's stick with the standard, which is href and an A tag. And so then there's doing links this way, and then there's the actual router portion, which I showed you just a minute ago. Yeah, there's so many things in this. I want to have this so fully functional that if you're doing a relatively small, and I'm talking about like medium size app down, this is the optimal choice. You don't need anything else. If your company's forcing you to use React or Angular or whatever, you can still do a large number of your things with this, and your components will run faster, substantially faster, because you don't have to sit there and rebuild everything. Or what happens at runtime is it says, oh, I'm going to go stick this in that text content or that inner HTML, or I'm going to go set the title attribute. And that's it. You can't get much faster than that. Any other questions? Yeah. Hmm? Yeah. Yeah, the router, I've got, so there's this file, which this is what breaks apart the whole routing thing, right? And this is what actually sets up the routing. And you can call .navigate on this if you want to. If you want to, through code, you want to navigate to somewhere, you can pass it through this. And then there is the router element. And this is the one that you set right here. These in here are not actual elements. This is just the data that feeds it. And so I just go through and say, I'll go give me all the children, make sure their tag name is WC route, and then I go through to it. This is one of the other things. If you haven't already imported a particular element, you can add it to this line, and it will not load until this URL is hit. And so you automatically get lazy loading out of it, which is really nice. Now, yes, you could take this whole package and you can go ahead and run it through a bundler. I'm not sure how no, this should still work because it would try to do the import and say it was already there and it would just work. So I have done some of this stuff through a bundler and it works fine. I haven't seen a problem with it. Eventually, I plan on having some substantial demonstrations of how to do this in React, Vue, and Angular. I'm going to try over the next year or two to speak at both the Angular and the React conferences, at least one or two of them, and have those talks very tailored to working in those frameworks. This works. I mean, I use this a lot already. So with PHP, Ruby, .NET, right, you eventually are using the elements inside of the DOM. Now, having this cross-compile to become a .NET object or to become, you know, I don't know, a Swift component, no, I'm not going there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can do it. Here's the thing. Those systems right now will render an input tag, or they'll render an audio tag or a video tag. These are just tags at that point. Now, hydration. I actually need some help on hydration, right? I want to be able to make this as up to date, right, with the way a lot of this stuff is working. And I don't have an idea for hydration. Context and Redux, the concept of context and Redux, I actually have a solution. I haven't fine-tuned it yet. But instead of you having to worry about it inside the component, you'll actually create a context tag and then be able to just use it inside. I mean, if it works the way I'm envisioning, it'll be one of the easiest ways in the world to create context. And if you want to have an app level context, you can put them in any level you want and you just name them, similar to the for loop where you give it a name. Your context will have a name and then you just use that inside to be able to get at it. One of the biggest problems I had with React is the minute you use context or the minute you use Redux, your component is no longer portable. It's tied to your app because your context or your Redux is set up for that app and your component is no longer portable. My goal on my version of state management is going to be state management will be completely independent of the component so that the component is fully portable. And it's your choice at design time to build a context or a state level management and not at development of the component. So that hopefully the components can be portable way beyond what anybody else is allowing you to do. Again, anybody who wants to play with this, feel free to, where did I put it? Feel free to contact me. Yeah, like I can remember where I was. There we go. I'm on UtahJS under Mike Collins, right? So if you're on UtahJS, which I expect most of you are, you can contact me that way. I know any email with a plus in it means that the plus and everything after it is ignored, but please send it to me this way. That way I'll know that you're talking to me about Evo, right? If you want to just send it to InterValley, I don't care, but I'd rather you include the Evo just so I'm aware that that's what this conversation is about. The repo, the website should both be available for the end of this month. Like I said, I'm really, really close. I've got, here, I'm at 13 open issues still, and I've created all of them. For example, one of them was I'm going to go ahead and add binding to the template tag. And what that will do is that will add binding to the outer layer of the component and not the elements inside of the component. And you might think, really, why would you do? Well, trust me, there are times that you might want to handle events on the component level based upon something that might happen inside of it that you don't have control over. If you're familiar with the way slots work within Shadow DOM, you can throw anything you want into those slots, and you might still want to be able to get events at your component level for what's inside of it. So that'll be added. And there's some enhancements and some bugs and so forth. I'll get all these finished. None of these are really complicated, except maybe this one. I tend to have all these done in about a half an hour to an hour each. So if you want to join the beta, just contact me, and I will get you connected to the current. Repo. I am going to move this. Right now, this is just Evo WC underneath mine. I'm actually going to create an Evo WC. What do they call those? It's project, group, whatever. Anyway, so it'll, in your node modules, it'll show up as @evo. And then this will be evo WC underneath that. Anything else? Okay, thank you all. I hope you found this good.